The classroom was unusually quiet as Mrs. Thompson, the strictest teacher in school, stood at the front, her sharp eyes scanning the room. Everyone knew she had favorites, students she praised endlessly, and others she barely acknowledged. One of those she ignored was Jamal, a quiet, reserved boy who mostly kept to himself. He was used to it by now. But today was different. Mrs. Thompson tapped her ruler against the desk. "Class, we're going to have a little entertainment," she said with a strange smile. "Jamal, why don't you come up here for us?" Jamal looked up, surprised. She never called on him, let alone asked him to come to the front. The other students exchanged glances, sensing something off. He hesitated, gripping the edge of his desk. "I said come up here," she repeated, her voice sharper. Slowly, Jamal rose to his feet and walked to the front. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his face calm. He had learned long ago that showing fear only made things worse. Mrs. Thompson turned to the class with a smirk. "You know, back in the old days, people had to entertain others to earn their place. Let's see if our dear Jamal here has any hidden talents." She gestured to the old grand piano sitting in the corner of the room. A few students chuckled nervously. They knew exactly what she was doing. Jamal's hands clenched into fists. He knew this was meant to humiliate him. He had never played the piano in front of anyone at school. No one knew about his secret. No one knew that he had spent years sneaking into his neighbor's house to practice on their piano because his family couldn't afford one. No one knew that when he played, the world disappeared and only the music remained. "Go on," Mrs. Thompson said, tilting her head. "Play something for us." The room fell into silence. Jamal stared at the piano. He could refuse. He could walk away. But something inside him pushed forward. He wasn't going to let her win. Slowly, he sat down on the bench. His fingers hovered over the keys. A deep breath. Then he played. The first note was soft, almost hesitant. But then the music swelled, filling the room with a melody so rich and powerful that it sent shivers down the spines of everyone listening. His fingers moved effortlessly, each note flowing into the next like water cascading down a river. Gasps rippled through the classroom. Eyes widened. Mrs. Thompson's smug expression faltered. Jamal lost himself in the music, his hands gliding over the keys with precision and emotion. He wasn't just playing. He was speaking through the notes, pouring every ounce of feeling into the melody. It wasn't just a song. It was a story of struggle, pain, and resilience. When he finally lifted his hands off the keys, the room remained silent for a long moment. Then someone clapped. It was soft at first, hesitant, but then another and another, until the entire class was applauding, some even cheering. Mrs. Thompson's face was pale. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Jamal stood up, locking eyes with her. He didn't need to say anything. His music had spoken louder than any insult she could ever throw at him. And for the first time, she was the one left speechless. But the moment didn't end there. Mrs. Thompson suddenly slammed her ruler against the desk, silencing the applause. "That's enough," she snapped, her voice trembling. "Get back to your seat." Jamal held her gaze for a moment longer before turning and walking back to his desk. But he knew something had changed. And so did Mrs. Thompson. Because deep down, she knew she had just lost control of something she never thought she would. The truth. Mrs. Thompson's fingers trembled slightly as she gripped her ruler tighter. Her eyes darted around the room, noticing how her authority, so absolute just moments ago, was slipping like sand through her fingers. The students were still whispering, exchanging glances filled with something unfamiliar. Respect. For Jamal. She could feel it in the way they looked at him now, as if he had transformed before their very eyes. He was no longer the quiet boy who sat in the back of the classroom, ignored and dismissed. He was something more, and that terrified her. She forced a tight-lipped smile and turned to the class. "Enough of this nonsense. We have a lesson to finish," she said, her voice strained, as if trying to force everything back to normal. "Open your books to page 74. But no one moved. Jamal could feel it, the shift in the air. He didn't need their approval, but something inside him warmed at the thought that, for the first time, they saw him for who he really was. Not just a black boy in a class that barely acknowledged him. Not just a target for a teacher who wanted to keep him small. He was a musician, a force, a presence. Mrs. Thompson's lips pressed together as she stared at him for a moment too long. Then she turned back to the board, scribbling something furiously. Jamal exhaled, finally allowing himself to sink back into his seat. But he knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next day, Jamal walked into class feeling different. The way students looked at him, nodded at him, even whispered about him. It was new. "Yo, that was insane," a boy named Eric muttered as Jamal passed his desk. "I didn't know you could play like that." "That was crazy, man," another voice chimed in. Jamal just shrugged. He didn't need to say anything. The music had spoken for him. But Mrs. Thompson? She was different. There was something unsettling in the way she carried herself. She didn't call on him the entire lesson, didn't acknowledge him. But her silence wasn't the kind that let him fade into the background. No, this was calculated. Then, just as the bell rang and students began packing up, her voice rang out. "Jamal, stay behind." A few students paused, exchanging wary glances. Jamal didn't react. He just nodded and stayed seated as the others filed out. The door shut. Mrs. Thompson turned to him slowly, folding her arms across her chest. "That was quite the performance yesterday," she said. Her voice was calm, too calm. Jamal said nothing. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of reacting. She sighed, shaking her head. "You must be very proud of yourself. But let me make something clear." She leaned in slightly. "This school is not a stage for you to show off." Jamal's jaw clenched. "Whatever little tricks you've picked up in your spare time, they don't change anything," she continued, her voice dropping lower. "People like you think you can impress everyone, and suddenly you belong." She chuckled. "That's not how the world works." Jamal met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "Are you done?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Thompson blinked. "Because if you are, I have better things to do." Her face darkened. "Watch yourself, Jamal." Jamal grabbed his bag and stood up, meeting her glare with something she wasn't expecting. Confidence. He didn't say another word, just turned and walked out. And as he left, he could feel her anger burning behind him. But he didn't care. He had already won. Days passed, but Jamal could feel the tension thickening like a storm waiting to break. Mrs. Thompson didn't speak of the incident, but she didn't need to. She was waiting. And then the opportunity came. A week later, an announcement echoed through the hallways. The annual school talent show. Jamal had never considered entering before. But this time, he knew he had to. Mrs. Thompson didn't say anything when she saw his name on the list. But the look she gave him when he walked past her desk said enough. "So, you think you can win?" Jamal smirked to himself. "We'll see." The night of the talent show arrived, and the auditorium was packed. The energy was electric, students buzzing with excitement. Jamal sat backstage, his fingers resting on his lap, calm but focused. He wasn't nervous. He was ready. One by one, students performed, singers, dancers, even a magician. The crowd cheered for all of them. And then, next up, Jamal Carter. The audience hushed. Jamal walked onto the stage, the grand piano gleaming under the lights. He took his seat and played. But this time, it was different. This wasn't about proving anything to Mrs. Thompson. This was about showing everyone, every single person in that room, who he really was. The melody flowed from his fingertips, filling the space with something indescribable. The notes swelled, dipped, soared. It wasn't just music. It was a rebellion, a declaration, a story that had never been told before. And by the time he struck the final note, the silence that followed was deafening. Then, an eruption of applause. Cheers. A standing ovation. Jamal stood up, scanning the crowd. His classmates, teachers, parents, all on their feet. And then, he saw her, Mrs. Thompson, standing in the back of the room, arms crossed. Her face unreadable. For the first time, she didn't look angry. She didn't look smug. She just looked defeated. Jamal held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned away. And for the first time in his life, he felt completely free. Jamal stepped off the stage, his heart still pounding, but not from nerves, from exhilaration. The moment was his. The applause still echoed in his ears, and as he made his way backstage, students reached out to him, slapping his back, nodding at him, congratulating him. "Man, that was insane," Eric said, his eyes wide with admiration. "You should be famous," another student added. Jamal just smiled. He didn't need to say anything. The music had already spoken for him. But then he felt it. A presence. He turned slightly, and there she was, Mrs. Thompson, standing just a few feet away, arms still crossed, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the talent show continued around them. Another student had taken a stage. The crowd was still lively. But in that instant, it was just the two of them. Jamal could see something in her eyes, something she was trying to hide. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being wrong. Mrs. Thompson opened her mouth, then closed it. She studied him for another second before turning on her heel and walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Jamal exhaled, but not in relief. He knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, Jamal walked into school feeling something different. Something he'd never felt before. Power. Not the kind that came from authority or fear. The kind that came from respect. Students greeted him in the halls. Some clapped him on the shoulder. Others just nodded at him. But the message was the same. They saw him now. They knew. But Mrs. Thompson? She was waiting. He could feel it the second he walked into her classroom. The air was heavier. The silence louder. She stood at the front, her usual stance, arms folded, expression firm. But something in her posture was off. "Take your seats," she said, her voice sharp. Jamal sat down, his eyes never leaving hers. Class began as usual, but there was an edge to her today, something colder. The way she moved, the way she spoke, it was all deliberate, calculated. And then, "Jamal," she said suddenly, snapping his name like a whip. The room went still. Jamal looked up. "Since you seem to enjoy performing so much," she said, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile, "why don't you come up here and solve this problem on the board?" A few students shifted uncomfortably. Jamal stood. He knew what this was. She wanted to humiliate him, to remind him that he was still beneath her. He walked to the board slowly, feeling every eye on him. Mrs. Thompson handed him the chalk, her fingers lingering just a second too long, as if savoring the moment. Jamal looked at the equation. It was complex, deliberately so. Something they hadn't even covered yet. A trap. He could hear the whispers behind him, the tension in the air. Jamal took a deep breath. Then he started solving. For a few seconds, the room was silent except for the sound of chalk against the board. Mrs. Thompson watched him, waiting for him to stumble, to hesitate. But he didn't. Jamal kept going, his movement steady, his mind sharp. And then, he put down the chalk, stepped back, turned around. The room was dead silent. Mrs. Thompson stared at the board, her face frozen. Because it was right. Perfectly right. Jamal met her gaze, waiting. For a moment, she just stood there. Then, her jaw clenched. "Sit down," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jamal did. And that was the moment everyone in that classroom knew. She had lost. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't done. Jamal knew at the second he was called into the principal's office later that day. He walked in, keeping his head high, his expression unreadable. Principal Harris sat at his desk, hands folded, expression calm. Mrs. Thompson stood beside him, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Jamal," Principal Harris said, motioning for him to sit. He did. Mrs. Thompson was the one who spoke first. "It seems," she said slowly, "that there's been some concern about your behavior in my class." Jamal raised an eyebrow. "Behavior," he echoed. Mrs. Thompson nodded. "Your attitude. Your unwillingness to follow instructions. And most recently, your participation in the talent show, without my approval." Jamal blinked. Was she serious? Principal Harris cleared his throat. Mrs. Thompson brought some concerns to my attention. She feels that your actions have been disruptive to the learning environment. Jamal exhaled slowly, steadying himself. So let me get this straight, he said, keeping his voice level. I played the piano in a talent show. I answered a question correctly in class. And that's disruptive. Mrs. Thompson's jaw tightened. Principal Harris hesitated. Well, when you put it like that, how else would you put it? Jamal interrupted. The room went silent. Then Mrs. Thompson spoke again, her voice laced with something darker. You're not as special as you think you are, Jamal. Jamal's fingers curled into fists. But he didn't take the bait. Instead, he smiled. Funny, he said. Because last night, a whole auditorium seemed to think otherwise. Mrs. Thompson's face darkened. That's enough, Principal Harris said, sighing. He looked at Jamal. You're free to go. Jamal stood, pausing only to glance at Mrs. Thompson one last time. You can't stop me, he said quietly. And then he walked out. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't just a teacher. She was a system. And systems don't like to lose. Jamal started noticing the little things first. His grades, once steady, began to drop. Assignments marked lower for reasons that didn't make sense. Classroom rules suddenly changed, rules that only seemed to apply to him. And then, one afternoon, as he walked down the hall, Hey, Carter. Jamal turned. 2 security officers stood there. You need to come with us. Jamal frowned. For what? Principal's orders, one of them said. Jamal hesitated. He could feel the eyes of students watching. He squared his shoulders. I didn't do anything. That's not for us to decide, the officer said. Jamal looked past them. And there, just barely visible down the hall, Mrs. Thompson, watching, waiting. And Jamal understood. She wasn't going to beat him in the classroom. She was going to use something bigger, something more dangerous. The system itself. But Jamal wasn't afraid. Because he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every student who had ever been told they weren't enough. And no matter what she did, she was never going to silence him. Because his music, his talent, his voice, they were louder than anything she could ever throw at him. And this was just the beginning. Jamal took a slow, steady breath as the security officers flanked him. His mind was racing, but his face remained calm. He could feel dozens of eyes on him, whispering voices carrying down the hallway. He knew exactly what Mrs. Thompson was trying to do, turn him into a troublemaker, someone the school would write off. Not today. He walked with the officers toward the principal's office, his shoulders squared. The moment he stepped inside, Principal Harris looked up from his desk. His expression was unreadable, but Mrs. Thompson was there too. Standing beside him, arms folded, a smug look on her face. Sit down, Jamal, Principal Harris said. Jamal didn't move. What exactly am I here for? Principal Harris sighed and gestured toward a stack of papers on his desk. There have been complaints, Jamal. Concerns about your behavior. Mrs. Thompson has reported multiple incidents, disrupting the learning environment, being defiant in class, and he picked up one of the papers. Altering your grade records. Jamal's heart stopped for a second. Then he let out a short, humorless laugh. Altering my grade records? Are you serious? Mrs. Thompson gave him a slow, deliberate nod. You seem to think you're above the rules, Jamal. That you can outsmart the system. But actions have consequences. Jamal clenched his fists. So let me get this straight. I play the piano too well, I answer a math problem correctly. And now I'm hacking into school records? You're the only one with a motive, Mrs. Thompson said smoothly. Your grades were dropping. Perhaps you wanted to fix them. Jamal took a step forward. Or maybe, he said, voice sharp, someone wanted them to drop in the first place. Principal Harris shifted in his seat. Enough, he said, rubbing his temples. Jamal, we have a serious situation here. If we don't get to the bottom of this, I may have no choice but to consider disciplinary action, possibly even suspension. Jamal's chest tightened. Suspension. That was what she wanted. She wanted him gone. Out of her class. Out of the school. He looked at Mrs. Thompson, and she didn't even try to hide the satisfaction in her eyes. But Jamal had been underestimated before. He wasn't going to let that happen again. You want the truth? Jamal said, turning back to Principal Harris. Fine. Then check the security footage. The school keeps records of every login attempt. If someone changed my grades, there'll be proof of who did it. Mrs. Thompson's face stiffened for just a second. Jamal caught it. So did Principal Harris. He hesitated, then picked up his phone. I'll have IT look into it, he said. If there's nothing there, then. There will be, Jamal cut in. Mrs. Thompson's lips pressed into a thin line. She knew. She knew she had just lost. For the first time, her composure cracked, just slightly. Her fingers tightened against her arms, her jaw clenching. Jamal didn't look away. He had won battles before. But this was war. By lunchtime, the entire school was buzzing. News traveled fast. Everyone knew Jamal had been accused of hacking grades. Everyone knew Mrs. Thompson was behind it. And now, everyone was waiting to see what the security footage would reveal. Jamal walked through the cafeteria, feeling the stares, hearing the murmurs. Some kids nodded at him in silent support. Others just watched, waiting. Yo, Eric called, waving him over. Sit with us, man. Jamal slid into the seat beside him. You think they'll find something? Eric asked. Jamal smirked. I don't think. I know. And he was right. An hour later, he was called back to the office. Only this time, Mrs. Thompson wasn't there. Principal Harris looked at him, his face unreadable. But Jamal could see it. The shift. The hesitation. You were right, Principal Harris admitted. IT reviewed the records. Someone did change your grades. He exhaled. It wasn't you. Jamal crossed his arms. And let me guess. It was Mrs. Thompson. Principal Harris didn't answer right away. She resigned, he finally said. Jamal blinked. Resigned? That wasn't what he expected. But then it made sense. Mrs. Thompson was powerful, but she wasn't invincible. If she got caught, she knew what would happen. Her reputation, her career, everything she built would crumble. So she ran before she could be pushed. Jamal let out a slow breath. It was over, but he didn't feel relief. Not completely. She's been at this school for 15 years, Principal Harris said, as if reading his thoughts. She's done a lot of good, but I won't excuse what she did to you. Or anyone else. Jamal nodded. He appreciated the honesty. But he wasn't just thinking about himself. How many others did she do this to? Jamal asked quietly. Principal Harris didn't answer. That silence told him everything. Jamal stood. I guess we'll never know. That afternoon, as he left the office, something strange happened. A group of students had gathered outside, waiting for him. He recognized some of them. Kids who had been quiet in class. Kids who had never spoken up. Kids who had sat in the back, unnoticed. But now, they stood in the hallway, watching him. And then, one of them clapped. Slow. Steady. Then, another. And another. Until the entire hallway was filled with applause. Jamal felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't just for him. This was for all of them. For every student who had ever been silenced. For every kid who had been told they weren't good enough. For every person who had ever been underestimated. He wasn't just Jamal Carter anymore. He was proof. Proof that talent couldn't be crushed. That voices couldn't be silenced. That no matter what the system threw at you, you could fight back and win.